Good evening, everybody. So my talk tonight is called Nothing to Effing Cheer About. And I should apologize at the outset, both for the profanity and for the split infinitive. They're both very out of character for me. But they're appropriate in this case because this past summer, the US Supreme Court found in favor of Brandy Levy. Levy was a sophomore at Mahanoy High School in Pennsylvania who tried out for the varsity cheerleading team but didn't make it and was assigned to the junior varsity instead. She was very upset about that decision, and with a friend, she went to a local convenience store where she dashed off a Snapchat message that directed some pretty offensive language at her school and its extracurricular activities. Some other friends took a screenshot of that message, brought it back to school, and showed it to the cheerleading coach, who, in the name of team morale, decided to suspend Levy from cheerleading for the rest of the year. Her parents sued. When the US Supreme Court found in Levy's favor, liberals cheered. The case seemed to challenge authority, to vindicate student rights, and to protect speech critical of the government. The American Civil Liberties Union is now selling T-shirts with Levy's message printed on the front. But even if you think that the case was rightly decided, I don't think that it's anything to cheer about. As someone who studies educational law, I was struck by the case's legal arguments, which seem to suggest deep disagreements and perhaps even incoherence in the way that courts and the American public conceive of school punishment. As someone who studies the philosophy of education, I was also surprised that so many commentators would celebrate legal principles without considering the attendant moral and educational responsibilities. And so with the rest of my talk tonight, I'd like to outline the three major arguments in the Mahanoy case and explain why I find them in the end to be unsatisfactory. First, writing for the majority of the court, Justice Stephen Breyer offers what we might call the citizenship argument for student speech. Breyer notes that schools themselves have an interest in protecting students' unpopular expression, especially when it takes place off campus, because, as he writes, schools are the nurseries of democracy. In making this argument, Breyer implies that criticism of the school is actually inseparable from its educational mission, insofar as it instills democratic habits of independence and dissent. Predictably, Breyer cites a famous civil liberties case, Tinker v. Des Moines, in which students were suspended for wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And this was the first time that the US Supreme Court found in favor of students' First Amendment free speech rights. In both this and the Mahanoy case, the key argument is that the public benefits from a robust exchange of ideas, and that as an arm of government, the school has no right to censor students' political speech. A second argument, put forward by Justice Samuel Alito in a concurring opinion, is that while bad language might be rightly punished during the school day, when the school stands in loco parentis, or in place of parents, by punishing a student's actions off campus, the cheerleading coach actually intruded into parental responsibility. We could call this the family privacy argument. Alito also cites a famous civil liberties ruling, Wisconsin v. Yoder. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that Amish families who had been hiding in cornfields rather than submit to forced public education at the secondary level had a right to religious exemption from high school. And more broadly, that all families have some expectation of privacy when it comes to education. Now, it's worth noting that the private protections that Alito references are distinct from the public benefits that Breyer invoked. It may be that family and student interests align against the government, for instance, if the two share a common religious belief. But even in the Yoder case, there was concern that they might not, and that by empowering families to make decisions for students, they might actually be limiting the student's own autonomy. And so in the Mahanoy case, you should note that by invoking family privacy, the court is actually not saying that Brandy Levy has the right to say anything at all in particular. In the case, the only voice in support of the school district was that of Justice Clarence Thomas, whose dissent advances what we might call the argument for order. Thomas points out that historically, schools have had wide latitude in how they punish students. In 1859, the Vermont Supreme Court ruled in a case very similar to Levy's, in which a student insulted his teacher outside of school, that teachers do have a right to punish off-campus behavior if it's likely to impinge on the operation or authority of the school itself. Thomas's opinion also aligns with more recent precedents. In the decades since Tinker v. Des Moines, the Supreme Court has actually sharply narrowed student speech rights on campus in the name of in loco parentis. Thus, when one student gave an assembly address that was laced with sexual innuendo, the court upheld his suspension and ruled that schools have the right to punish disruptive speech. When another student unfurled a sort of nonsensical banner at a school event, this is the famous Bong Hits for Jesus case, the Supreme Court upheld his punishment as well, in the name of preventing drug abuse or drug use. But I think that it's a diminishment to assume that schools punish student speech merely as a means of keeping order. There's an inextricable link between punishment and moral education, insofar as wrongdoing demands reflection, atonement, and sometimes the imposition of hardship to make things right. I also think that it's a mistake to view schools simply as an arm of government, rather than as collaborative, community-based, and fundamentally educational institutions. And I'm not sure how those institutions can impart any kind of moral lesson when students are free to disregard those lessons the moment they step off campus. Now, you'll notice that I'm no longer making strictly legal arguments, but that's exactly the point. In our recent book, Bryan Warnick and I argue that just school punishment is far more likely to result from the creation of moral communities than it is from adversarial rights claims. If families or students hope to make moral rather than simply legal claims against their school, and if schools hope to hold students to certain moral expectations, there needs to be at least a rough congruence between the classroom and the home. A more robust consensus around moral questions than our increasingly managerial schools seem willing to uphold, and which we as citizens fail to uphold when we cheer for students who flout the rules. Thank you.